The Battle of the Little Bighorn, waged on June 25, 1876, continues to occupy a unique and enduring place in the history of warfare. Its potent blend of heroism, tragedy, and controversy has captivated generations, inspiring countless books, documentaries, and Hollywood films. Despite its relatively small scale when compared to the vast carnage of the American Civil War, which had raged just a decade earlier, the battle has sparked an extraordinary level of discussion and debate. It has stirred emotions, divided opinions, and prompted arguments among historians, enthusiasts, and descendants of those involved alike. What is it about this clash that makes it resonate so deeply in the American consciousness? At first glance, the Battle of Little Bighorn may seem minor compared to the large-scale conflicts of the Civil War, where countless lives were lost in a single day. However, the significance of that hot June day in Montana, when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his men faced defeat against the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, goes beyond mere casualty figures. This battle epitomizes the clash between U.S. westward expansion and the Plains tribes' struggle to protect their land and culture. The personalities involved, the mystery of Custer's final moments, and the ideological conflict elevate it to a defining moment in the history of the American West. The Little Bighorn story is not just about a battle, it reflects a nation's identity and its struggle to reconcile with its past. The site, now tranquil, draws visitors eager to stand where Custer and the 7th Cavalry met their tragic end. Guided by Patrick Hill, a Crow Pawnee Indian and expert on the battle, we will explore Custer's overconfidence, the unease of Native American scouts, and the errors that led to the disastrous events on Last Stand Hill. This journey will illuminate the missteps of Custer's command and offer insight into the people who influenced the outcome of that fateful day. Part of the enduring fascination with the Battle of the Little Bighorn can be attributed to the presence of its most iconic figure, George Armstrong Custer. Custer was no ordinary soldier. He was a genuine American Civil War hero, known for his boldness and flair. His daring exploits on the battlefield had captured the attention of federal newspapers, earning him widespread adulation. Throughout the war, he was brevetted for gallantry an impressive 5 times, his actions propelling him to the rank of general at an astonishingly young age. Dubbed the Boy General, Custer's rapid rise through the ranks was nothing short of meteoric. He fought from the war's beginning to its conclusion, and played a pivotal role in the final campaign that led to the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. Despite these accomplishments, Custer was far from a one-dimensional hero. He was a man of contrasts, brave yet reckless, admired yet controversial. His complexity, a blend of charisma, ambition, and often impetuous decisions, only deepens the intrigue surrounding his life and the ill-fated battle that would ultimately define his legacy. There is no doubt that Custer was as brave as a lion and relentless in his duties as a soldier. Yet, alongside his courage was an equally strong streak of arrogance, autocracy, and ruthless single-mindedness. He was well aware of his striking good looks, and his ego was immense, often on full display. This was evident in his signature black suits, which he had custom-made, sharp, stylish, and far from regulation. Custer was not a man who followed the rules by the book. His greatest victories were often the result of a stubborn, military boldness, combined with what many called Custer's luck, a mysterious force upon which he leaned heavily, especially on that fateful day of June 25, 1876. However, by the time of the Little Bighorn, the luster of Custer's fame had begun to fade. Though he had been celebrated for his role in suppressing Native American resistance on the plains, these victories came at a brutal cost. His ruthless tactics had earned him the deep and lasting hatred of the Plains tribes. The man who had once been hailed as a Civil War hero was now embroiled in a far different and more complex conflict, where his legendary luck would finally run out. However, Custer had not always been in favor with his superiors. In fact, he had run afoul of military authority, resulting in a court-martial and suspension from duty. It was only shortly before 1876 that he had been reinstated to the 7th Cavalry. By June of that year, Custer was a man on a mission to reclaim his former glory and restore his tarnished reputation. Over the years, his relentless ambition had made him more than a few enemies within the U.S. Army, as his pursuit of career advancement often left others in his shadow. Two of those men played crucial roles in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, forever entwining their fates with his. Major Marcus A. Reno, Custer's second-in-command, and Captain Frederick W. Benteen, the regiment's senior captain, stood among the ranks of those who harbored resentment towards him. Reno, a fellow Civil War veteran who had been brevetted 3 times for gallantry, had a personal disdain for Custer. He was deeply envious of Custer's fame and successes, both as a soldier and as a public figure. This animosity and the complex interpersonal dynamics between these officers would shape the events that unfolded on the battlefield, adding another layer of intrigue to the already infamous conflict. The U.S. government saw the Native Americans in this region as a threat, primarily due to concerns for the safety of both non-indigenous settlers and their indigenous allies. Their objective was to confine native tribes to designated areas known as reservations, lands that were a fraction of the vast territories the native peoples once roamed. These reservations were established through treaties, with promises that the land would belong to the tribes for as long as the grass shall grow and the water shall flow. However, these promises were often broken, especially after the discovery of gold and the increasing desire for settlement in those areas. The lure of prosperity drove non-indigenous settlers to covet the land, and the federal government, prioritizing expansion and wealth over treaty obligations, deemed it necessary to forcefully confine Native Americans to their reservations. Ultimately, military intervention became the government's chosen means of enforcing this containment, setting the stage for violent confrontations like the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On December 3, 1875, the U.S. government issued a proclamation declaring that after January 31, 1876, any Native American found outside the designated reservations would be deemed hostile. Ironically, just 8 years earlier, the very lands from which the government now sought to remove the tribes had been granted to them as part of treaty agreements. To the outraged native tribes, this blatant reversal rendered the promises of the white man worthless. With nothing left to lose, conflict seemed inevitable. The proclamation of December 3rd was largely ignored by the tribes, leaving the U.S. government with little option but to forcefully relocate the Native Americans back to their reservations. This difficult task was entrusted to Major General Alfred H. Terry, a seasoned military commander experienced in such campaigns. Major General Alfred H. Terry devised a strategy to subdue the Native American forces by employing a 3-pronged approach. The plan involved 3 columns of U.S. troops advancing from the north and south, intending to trap the tribes and force them to retreat back to their reservations. Terry himself would lead one of the columns, meeting up with a second force, commanded by Colonel John Gibbon, along the northern banks of the Yellowstone River. Meanwhile, Brigadier General George Crook would lead the third column, advancing from the south. In total, over 2,500 U.S. soldiers were mobilized for this operation, with Custer's 7th Cavalry falling under Terry's overall command. However, the plan began to unravel from the outset. Terry had significantly underestimated the strength of the native forces. Rather than facing a small, scattered resistance, the U.S. Army found itself up against a much larger force. The number of native warriors available for battle was nearly double what had been anticipated, with an estimated 1,500 braves preparing to meet the advancing troops. This miscalculation would prove to be a critical error, setting the stage for the devastating events that would soon follow at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On June 21st, George Armstrong Custer joined his fellow officers aboard the steamer Far West to hear Major General Terry unveil the next phase of his plan. Custer's role was to advance up the Rosebud Valley and then cross over to the Little Bighorn, positioning himself as a blocking force to prevent the Native Americans from escaping through the southern end of the valley. The strategy hinged on the coordinated attack of all 3 columns of troops. However, Terry's written orders to Custer left room for interpretation. He wrote that he had too much confidence in your zeal, energy, and ability to wish to impose upon you precise orders, which might hamper your action when nearly in contact with the enemy. For Custer, this was nothing short of a gift. He interpreted Terry's words as a clear endorsement of his autonomy, a vote of complete trust in his capabilities and judgment. To him, the order was confirmation of the general's unwavering faith in his leadership, giving him the freedom to act as he saw fit when facing the enemy. Naturally, Terry wanted the operation to unfold smoothly according to the established plan. However, Custer perceived that if the situation called for a deviation from the overall strategy, he now had Terry's written consent to act independently. This presented a golden opportunity for both the 7th Cavalry and, more crucially, for George Armstrong Custer himself to achieve glory. On June 22, 1876, Custer set out at the helm of the 7th Cavalry, clad in his distinctive fringed buckskin suit, embodying both the spirit and the style of a daring frontiersman. Yet, unbeknownst to him, Terry's operational plan was already in disarray. Just 5 days prior, on June 17th, Crook's column had been ambushed by a formidable force of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors near the waters of the Rosebud. This confrontation had severely decimated Crook's command, forcing them to retreat to Fort Fetterman in a desperate bid for safety while they awaited reinforcements. The situation was more precarious than Custer realized, setting the stage for the unfolding drama that would lead to the infamous clash at the Little Bighorn. Custer would first arrive in the area on the evening of June 24, 1876, settling at a location known as Davis Creek, which is near the present-day community of Busby, Montana, situated on the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation. This site is approximately due east of the Little Bighorn battlefield. That evening, he established a camp and called for an officers' meeting. During this gathering, several officers expressed the possibility of relocating the camp to get closer to the presumed location of the village, believed to be situated within the Little Bighorn Valley. Although they did not know the exact position of the village, they anticipated its proximity, especially since June was a time when many Native Americans gathered to participate in communal activities, including the sun dance. The sun dance is a significant religious ceremony among various tribes, celebrating the return of the sun and giving thanks for the bounty it provides. It symbolizes the hope for a prosperous harvest and the renewal of life, drawing many tribes together in unity and tradition during this sacred time. On the evening of June 24th, Custer ordered his men to break camp and prepare for a move, despite the long march they had endured that day. The soldiers would continue to march through the night and into the morning of June 25th, covering significant ground as they made their way to a location known today as Reno Creek, which was then referred to as Ash Creek. This creek lies several miles from their previous camp, approximately 7 miles up the ridge of the Wolf Mountains, known at that time as the Wolf Tooth Mountains. Along the skyline in that area is a flat expanse known as Crow's Nest, named for its historical significance. Here, Crow Scouts and Rickrell Scouts would position themselves to observe the village, which was located about 14.5 miles down into the valley floor. This vantage point was crucial, as it provided a strategic view of the area where the battle would later unfold that same morning. That evening, the scouts, including Charles Warner, Mitch Boyer, and Gerard, alongside the Rickrell Scouts, took up their positions and remained vigilant throughout the night. On the morning of June 25th, they turned their attention to the valley, located 14.5 miles away. The Crow Scouts, relying solely on their keen eyesight, remarked on the sight of numerous horses moving in the valley below. They described the scene to the others, saying, "Look beyond the hill, it moves like worms," indicating there were approximately 10,000 to 14,000 horses in that area. Among those observing was Charles Varnum, who later noted, "My eyes were as good as any man's, but I could not see what they saw." He attributed this to the dust and fatigue from their arduous march, which may have obscured his vision. The Crow Scouts persisted in their observations and returned to inform Custer of their findings. When Custer arrived at the Crow's Nest area, though he did not reach the exact point of observation, he used binoculars to scan the valley but was unable to discern the vast numbers described by the scouts. The scene before him remained elusive, despite the urgency of the situation. It was likely later that morning of June 25th when mist or smoke obscured the view down in the valley. Custer, along with his aides, Varnum, Boyer, and Girard, gazed into the distance, contemplating their next move. Concerned for their safety, those with him cautioned, "Sir, if we descend into that valley, we will confront more Indians than we ever anticipated. We could be fighting for at least 2 to 3 days." Custer, however, remained resolute. "We'll just have to do it in one," he replied confidently. Among his companions was Mitch Boyer, a half-breed scout of Sioux and French descent. He cautioned, "Sir, if there aren't more Indians down there than you have ever seen, you can kill me." Custer, known for his brashness, replied with a wry grin, "Well, we damn well better kill you." The Indian scouts, who had a more intimate understanding of the situation, added to the growing sense of urgency, asserting, "There are more Indians there than there is grass on the side of the hill." Custer felt the pressure to engage that day, convinced that action was necessary, regardless of the overwhelming odds they might face. Custer had initially hoped to remain within the safety of the Wolf Mountains on the evening of June 25th, planning to launch an early morning attack on June 26th. However, he would not be afforded this opportunity. The orders given to him by General Terry emphasized that he should act according to his own zeal and initiative, making it clear that engagement with the enemy was necessary. The situation had evolved to a point where waiting for a rendezvous was no longer feasible, foretelling the ominous nature of the impending conflict. One scout lamented, "I shall not see the sunrise for me again. It shall not rise for me again," highlighting the grim reality that loomed over them. Upon reaching the ridge, Custer made a critical decision to detach Captain Frederick Benteen and his company. Benteen commanded a pack train of approximately 125 mules and about 200 men. This maneuver was part of Custer's strategy to prepare for the battle ahead, even as the foreboding atmosphere thickened around them. Custer ordered Benteen to move off at a left oblique, directing him to traverse 2 or 3 ridges. He instructed Benteen, "If you come into contact with the enemy, inform us, and we will provide assistance as quickly as possible." The exact distance Benteen traveled remains uncertain even years later. He would later state that he had no idea why Custer had sent him off on that ridge. "I knew for a fact there were 10,000 Indians in that valley. I didn't see any reason to go out there and conjure up more trouble," he remarked after the events of June 25, 1876. Meanwhile, Custer and his remaining troops advanced down the valley floor alongside Major Reno, who was positioned on the opposite side of the creek. Custer called over to Reno, who was at a location known as the Morass, or Swampy Point, instructing him, "You shall go down, following the stream until it enters the Little Bighorn River." This coordination was vital, as both commanders aimed to position their forces strategically for the confrontation that lay ahead. The tension in the air was palpable as they prepared to engage in what would become one of the most infamous battles in American history. Custer instructed Reno, "You shall go down, cross the river, and attack the village from the south. After you engage, we will back you up." With those orders in hand, Reno prepared to move out, leading a contingent of 40 Iroquois scouts and approximately 240 men. Meanwhile, Custer remained on his side of the creek, advancing parallel to Reno's position. As they approached the morass, the swampy area where Custer had issued his command, both Reno and Custer were focused on executing their respective parts of the plan. Custer had emphasized that his entire force would provide support for Reno's assault on the village. With the plan set in motion, Reno proceeded down the opposite side of the valley, while Custer continued on his side, each commander keenly aware of the impending confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, as both forces prepared to engage the enemy, unaware of the challenges that awaited them in the valley below. As Custer and his men advanced along what is now known as the Great Cliffs, they moved toward a knoll in the distance, unaware of the secrets it held. This knoll, obscured from their view, harbored a long teepee that would soon become pivotal in their unfolding narrative. The Crow Scouts riding ahead returned with a grim discovery: the body of an Indian man dressed in his finest clothing. It was evident that his family had left him there, perhaps believing he had transitioned to the other side, after suffering fatal wounds from the recent Battle of the Rosebud. As Custer and his men approached the teepee, they were struck by the reality of the situation. They were looking at a fallen warrior, yet the circumstances of his death remained unclear to them. Confusion arose among the ranks regarding how the teepee had caught fire. Some scouts claimed the troopers had ignited it, while others insisted it was the scouts who had set it ablaze. Regardless of who was responsible, the structure was now reduced to ashes, leaving a sense of foreboding in its wake. This incident heightened their awareness. They felt that their presence had not gone unnoticed, intensifying the already palpable tension as they considered the possibility of encountering other Indians in the area. The weight of impending conflict loomed larger as they continued their advance into unknown dangers. Custer and his men moved past the small knoll, pressing forward until they encountered approximately 40 Indians on horseback. A scout quickly returned to Custer with a report, exclaiming, "There go your Indians, they are running like the devil." Without hesitation, Custer took off in pursuit of the fleeing warriors, determined to engage them. Meanwhile, Reno continued his advance down the valley floor, following the orders Custer had given him to attack the village from the south. As Custer descended the great cliffs, he maneuvered to the opposite side of where Reno was positioned. His focus was unwavering as he made his way toward the lone teepee, situated at the end of the great cliffs. Little did he know that this teepee held the body of a warrior who had succumbed to wounds inflicted during the recent Battle of the Rosebud on June 17th. The paths of Custer and Reno were destined to converge in a moment that would alter the course of history, but for now, each was consumed by their respective missions, unaware of the impending clash that awaited them on the plains below. Custer advanced through the area, spurred on by a scout who rode back with urgent news. "There go your Indians, they're fleeing like the devil." About 40 Native American warriors had taken flight, and Custer, driven by the prospect of glory, immediately set off in pursuit. However, he was blissfully unaware of the greater danger that lay just beyond the ridge. The fleeing warriors were not mere decoys. They were rushing to alert their compatriots about the presence of Custer's forces. On that fateful day, June 25th, Custer commanded around 5 companies, totaling approximately 225 men, as he prepared to launch an assault on the village. Meanwhile, Reno, positioned on the opposite side, had around 140 men under his command. Farther in the distance, Benteen, following Custer's earlier orders, was maneuvering with the pack train on a left oblique path. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of history, yet Custer's focus remained singularly on the immediate pursuit, unaware of the overwhelming force that awaited him. Reno was unaware that he was about to engage with hostile Sioux and Cheyenne warriors as he moved down the valley floor, while Custer prepared to confront them from a distance. On that fateful day, June 25th, the river was swollen from heavy rainfall, complicating Reno's approach. As they neared the river, Reno ordered his men to dismount, instructing them to check their firearms and tighten their cinches in preparation for the upcoming assault on the village from the south. Custer had assured Reno that the full outfit shall back you up. As they approached the opposite bank, they noticed around 40 Arikara scouts, perhaps 35, riding past them on horses they had captured from the camp. Across the valley, a staggering sight awaited them. Approximately 10,000 horses grazed peacefully, a testament to the village's wealth and size. This stark contrast heightened the tension as Reno and his men readied themselves for the impending confrontation. The horses across the valley belonged to the Sioux and Cheyenne Arapaho tribes. As the Arikara scouts rode past Reno and his men, they wondered about their destination and purpose. Upon crossing the swollen river, one Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, remained with Reno's contingent. His presence was notable since he was Custer's favored scout, yet the reasons for his continued association with Reno were unclear. Reno, commanding approximately 125 to 140 men, directed them to head north and initiate their attack on the village from the south. They began with a trot, quickly escalating to a full gallop. However, dense vegetation concealed the village from their view, obscuring it until it was far too late to prepare adequately. They were unaware of Custer's position, who was maneuvering along the ridge, potentially unaware of the unfolding events below. As Reno emerged from the timber with his men, he prepared to follow Custer's orders to attack the village from the south. Exiting the woods, he transitioned from a walk to a trot, then broke into a full run across the valley floor. However, visibility remained limited. The village was still hidden from view. Suddenly, he spotted a number of Indians on horseback emerging from the village, prompting him to quickly order his men to dismount and establish a skirmish line. The skirmish line was organized so that each soldier would manage 4 horses, along with their own, while firing at the advancing Indians. As the enemy approached in increasing numbers, Reno later recalled that it seemed as if the ground itself was teeming with warriors, hundreds and hundreds of them pouring forth from a small ravine near the village. Reno and his men unleashed volleys of fire toward the village as the Indians surged from their positions. Just below their location, Reno ordered his horse holders to move toward the river. However, as he glanced over his shoulder, he realized with alarm that the Indians had breached his left flank, encircling his position and coming from the rear. He felt as though he had walked into an ambush. In response, he commanded his men to retreat toward the area where the horses were held. The relentless circling of the enemy forced them back into the timber, where they established a defensive position. In this chaotic engagement, they suffered 2 wounded soldiers and lost another 2 men, whose horses fled toward the village. The bodies of these soldiers would later be found, mutilated, and left behind in the camp. Now entrenched in the timber, Reno's men prepared to hold their ground against the encroaching hostiles. Imagine the chaos as the eerie sound of eagle wing bone whistles fills the air, accompanied by the fierce war cries of the Indians. Gunfire erupts around Reno and his men, and amid the chaos, he begins a frantic exchange in sign language with Bloody Knife, the Arikara scout. Suddenly, a bullet strikes Bloody Knife in the head, and the impact sends blood, brain matter, and fragments of his skull splattering onto Reno's face. Stunned and unnerved by this violent turn of events, Reno issues a flurry of commands, first ordering his men to mount, then to dismount, and back again to mount. The confusion is palpable. The soldiers are caught in a whirlwind of orders, unsure of what to do next. As Reno emerges from the timber onto the valley floor, chaos continues to reign. It is here that Charlie Reynolds, known as Lothian, meets his end. Further along, Ezra Dorman, a slave and the only black man in the unit, also finds himself caught in the crossfire. In this moment of turmoil, the stakes have never been higher, and the atmosphere is thick with dread and uncertainty. As the chaos unfolded, the air was filled with the chilling sound of eagle wing bone whistles, accompanied by the fervent war cries of the Indians as they unleashed their fire into the timber. Amidst this turmoil, Reno found himself struggling to communicate effectively, especially with Bloody Knife, the Arikara scout, at his side. The situation escalated further when a bullet struck Bloody Knife in the head, sending blood and fragments splattering onto Reno's face. This gruesome sight left Reno visibly shaken. In a flurry of confusion, he issued contradictory commands to his men, first to mount, then to dismount, and back again. The soldiers, caught in this whirlwind of orders, were left bewildered, uncertain of their next move. Reno finally decided to exit the timber, directing his men across the valley floor. Tragically, this is where Charlie Reynolds, also known as Lothian, met his end. Continuing the retreat, they were also joined by Ezra Dorman, a slave and the only black man among them, who was married to Sue. As they pressed on, McIntosh, an Iroquois Indian fighting alongside them, fell to enemy fire. As they fled towards the river, the Indians pursued them relentlessly, likening their chase to that of buffalo. The military accounts would later describe how the soldiers came off a 4-foot bluff into 6 to 8 feet of water. The relentless pressure from the Indians forced them into the river, where the water quickly turned red with blood from the injuries sustained. They struggled to navigate the steep cliffs on the other side, desperately seeking a defensive position. In this tumultuous retreat, they also lost Benny Hodgkin, Reno's adjutant, who had harbored ominous premonitions of his death before the battle even began. The scene was one of panic and desperation as they fought for their lives amidst the chaos of war. He believed himself to be safe near the water, but fate had other plans. It was there that DeWolf, a surgeon who had graduated from Harvard Medical School just a year prior, was killed. His aide, Clear, fell alongside him as they ascended the ridge. In the midst of chaos, some soldiers scrambled up the hill, some grabbing onto the tails of horses as they were pulled up in desperation. Once they reached the ridge, they took their position, though uncertainty loomed. Custer had ordered them to attack the village from the south, assuring them that the full outfit would back them up. Yet, as Reno glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, he found no sign of Custer's support. Benteen remained distant, his location unclear amidst the turmoil. Years later, accounts would emerge that claimed they spotted Custer on the ridge, and in a fleeting moment, they recognized him as he waved, a sign of hope as they entered the fray. But the reality was grim, and as the battle raged, the men were left to face the overwhelming odds without the promised reinforcements. Orders were urgently being relayed back to Custer. The first message was delivered by Benny Hodgkin, who rushed to the pack train with a request for swift action. "Come quick to bring the packs." The second order was entrusted to Giovanni Mortini, a recent immigrant from Italy. He carried a message through W. Cook, Custer's adjutant, which read, "Big village, come quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." Giovanni hurried back to the pack train, which began its trek, picking up the trail left by Custer's horses. As they moved through the landscape, the sound of gunfire echoed ominously in the distance. Meanwhile, Reeder pressed onward, unaware that he had already lost half of his command, who had remained behind in the timber, encircled and overwhelmed by the Sioux and Cheyenne. On the ridge, the marks of Wolf and Clear were evident as they called out warnings. "You're going the wrong way. You're going the wrong way." But it was too late. They were met with the deadly aim of Sioux and Cheyenne sharpshooters positioned on the hill, who took aim and shot them down. Reno and his men established a defensive position, intending to hold off the advancing Sioux and Cheyenne until reinforcements arrived, either from Custer or Benteen. However, their efforts proved fruitless. They remained in their makeshift fortification, anxiously waiting for assistance. In the distance, after the urgent messages sent by Custer had reached Benteen, the sounds of gunfire echoed ominously. Benteen, alerted by the commotion, moved toward Reno's location. Reno, desperate and aware of the dire situation, managed to write a note to him. "My God, Benteen, stay with me. I've lost half my men." The two men briefly discussed the message delivered by Giovanni Martini to W. Cook, Custer's adjutant, regarding the pack train. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Benteen chose to stay with Reno, providing support in their defensive position. Neither man knew the whereabouts of Custer, who had moved northward, leaving them in a precarious position as the battle intensified around them. Reno and his men held their ground at the defensive site, anxiously awaiting assistance from other forces they were unaware were advancing along the Little Bighorn River. On the ridge nearby, James Calhoun, George Custer's brother-in-law, commanded 2 companies, acting as a rear guard, to protect the main contingent from the encroaching Indians, who were pursuing them from the direction of Medicine Tail Coulee. In the distance lay Weir Point, a strategic landmark from which Custer had sent messages back to Knipe, instructing him to retrieve the pack trains. As Custer moved deeper into enemy territory, it was rumored within Indian accounts that he met his demise in the river. This was the location where he had launched an attack on the larger-than-anticipated Sans Arc village. Witnesses from the village would later recount, "We shot a man. He fell off his horse," emphasizing the intensity of the confrontation and the surprising strength of the opposing force. He fell into the river, where the Indians retrieved his body, dressed in buckskin. It was customary for officers during that period to wear buckskin jackets and pants, which was common military attire. Approximately 8 men dressed similarly to Custer were also spotted, leading to confusion about the identity of the fallen. The last confirmed sighting of Custer had him with his buckskin coat rolled up and tied across the pommel of his saddle, indicating that it was not him who was killed in the river. Following that retreat, a significant number of Indians pursued the 2 companies, while the remaining 3 companies that Custer commanded were positioned on a ridge nearby. As the 2 companies fell back under heavy attack, They provided fire support to cover their retreat, engaging the advancing forces of Sioux and Cheyenne, who were intent on overwhelming them. On this hill, known as Calhoun Hill, officers likely convened to establish a rear guard and provide support for the pack train that was arriving. The Indians, having engaged Reno and Benteen, were now aware of a new threat to their village. Realizing the urgency to protect their women and children, they shifted their focus and moved to repel this aggressive force encroaching on their territory. They confronted the advancing soldiers at this hill, which became a critical point of resistance. Meanwhile, 2 or 3 additional companies, alongside Custer, moved northward. 2 companies remained on Calhoun Hill, while others were sent down the ridge, known as Risey Grass Ridge. This area would soon become a site of heavy casualties, as waves of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, led by prominent figures such as Gall and 2 Moons, surged over the ridge, overwhelming the soldiers stationed there. Gall, having faced the devastating reality of the initial skirmish with Reno, returned to the village, only to discover that his 2 wives and 3 daughters had been killed in the attack. Overwhelmed by grief and anger, he resolved to lay down all his weapons, except for his battle axe and knife, choosing to engage in hand-to-hand combat. With nothing left to lose, he sought to confront his enemies directly, believing he had nothing to live for after losing his family. Despite his determination to fight, he would not be easily killed. Instead, he would take the lives of many that day. Nearby, in a ravine known as Horseholder Ravine, soldiers were struggling to manage more horses than they could handle, with some holding on to as many as 8. The Indians, witnessing the chaos, observed that all they needed to do was wave their buffalo robes and blankets, and the soldiers would flee, dragging their horses behind them. The soldiers' attempts to shoot their guns into the air were largely ineffective. They were firing wildly, unable to control their weapons or the frightened horses. This panicked response did no harm to the Indians, only highlighting the desperation of the situation. The Indians noted, all we had to do was ride over them, as they caught the soldiers in a shallow depression, leaving them vulnerable. With little time to react, the soldiers fired a few desperate shots. Amid the chaos, a Cheyenne warrior rallied his fellow fighters, exclaiming, "We can kill them all today." Custer and his men, including his brothers and second-in-command Miles Walter Keogh, initially advanced toward the river but had to retreat to what became known as Last Stand Hill. From Calhoun Hill, 3 companies fought valiantly but faced relentless Indian attacks. Custer nearly reached the river before being forced back, as Sioux and Cheyenne numbers surged. The soldiers constructed makeshift breastworks, using horses for protection. Indians later recounted that they simply had to rise from the grass and shoot, with smoke and chaos enveloping the hill. The battle lasted approximately half an hour according to Indian accounts, contrasting with military reports of 1 to 1.5 hours. A young warrior named Wooden Lakes vividly recalled crawling among the bodies, overwhelmed by the violence he witnessed. In Deep Ravine, many soldiers were killed, and Crazy Horse played a pivotal role in the final assault against Custer's men. Weir, observing from a distance, decided to investigate the gunfire, and later witnessed thousands of Indians converging on the battlefield. He retreated to where Reno and Benteen were stationed, unaware of Custer's fate. As the Indians withdrew with dignity, Reno, Benteen, and their men remained on high alert, not knowing that Custer had fallen. On June 27, 1876, General Terry and Colonel Gibbons arrived at the battlefield, discovering 197 dead soldiers. When informed that Custer was among the fallen, it cast a somber shadow over their camp. The wounded remained until Terry and Gibbons arrived to escort them for burial. The bodies of the fallen were hastily interred, with Custer receiving a slightly deeper grave. The arduous journey to safety took an astonishing 54.5 hours, and the soldiers faced numerous challenges along the way. As the nation celebrated its birthday on July 4th, news of Custer's defeat broke 2 days later, creating disbelief about the loss of life in a nation asserting its strength. The battlefield became a symbol of loss for both sides, with many young lives cut short. The conflict marked the end of traditional ways of life for Native Americans, who faced increasing pressure to surrender their lands. The Bismarck Tribune reported on the Custer Massacre, detailing the brutality of the battle and questioning congressional response. Over a century later, the battlefield remains shrouded in mystery, with many secrets yet to be uncovered. The soldiers who died in Deep Ravine had become separated during the chaos, and no markers were placed to honor their sacrifice. The bodies of each troop were never recovered, and the medical officer's fate is uncertain. Ultimately, Custer died on Last Stand Hill, his body untouched by mutilation, unlike many others. Custer's brothers, along with other men who sought adventure, also perished. The fallen troopers were buried in a mass grave, while Custer was reinterred at West Point, intertwining his legacy with the nation. Meanwhile, Reno and his men displayed courage but faced blame for the defeat. Although a court cleared him of direct culpability, support was limited, leaving him to contend with the tragic aftermath of the battle and Custer's overshadowing legacy. The Little Bighorn battle remains significant in American history, with the legend of Custer's last stand captivating the imagination and securing its place in the nation's narrative. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to support our efforts in creating engaging historical content, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. Don't forget to subscribe to help us keep history alive and thriving.